In the 1580s, the Polish-Lithuanian nobleman Mikołaj Krzysztof Radziwiłł, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, embarked on a harrowing journey through the Middle East and parts of the Mediterranean. During his travels, he visited Alexandria in Egypt, where he procured 2 mummies of opposing genders and smuggled them aboard a ship headed back to Europe. However, the journey was a treacherous one, racked by storms and the dire warnings of a priest tormented by monstrous visions of 2 spirits. In desperation, Radziwiłł threw the mummies and their treasures into the sea, after which the skies immediately cleared and the priest stopped having visions. This was the first recorded instance of a mummy's curse. Though there is little rational evidence for mummy curses being real, they were popularized by the false narrative that a curse was inscribed somewhere on the tomb of King Tutankhamun and plagued the archaeologists who uncovered it in 1922. However, it was a long-running belief for centuries before even then that mummies are inherently cursed. 20th century scientists even attempted to explain them by hypothesizing the existence of ancient illnesses locked away with the pharaohs. Though their conclusions are dubious at best, the myth of the mummy's curse stood the test of time throughout the 20th century, with mummies standing tall beside Dracula and Frankenstein's monster as creatures of cultural consciousness. Call it European guilt over colonial-era pilfering of other nations, or a lingering fear of meddling in affairs we can never understand, the truth is that the curse of the mummy never stays buried for long.
Archaeologists Stephen Banning and Joseph Wimple have just unearthed the long-coveted tomb of the ancient Egyptian princess Ananka. But after discovering the scroll of life buried alongside her, Banning goes mad, forcing the expedition to an early conclusion. 3 years later, Banning's son John learns from his institutionalized father that what made him crack was not Ananka, but the horrible undead creature protecting her, a disgraced priest from 4 centuries ago that is now being unleashed to take revenge on those who desecrated the tomb. Struggling to believe such a fantastic tale, John doesn't have long before he finds himself in the deadly crosshairs of the mummy.
Due to the massive success of Hammer's Dracula, Universal International finally agreed to lend out the rights to a few of its classic monster movies, starting with The Mummy. Given how well the Hammer formula had worked thus far, producer Michael Carreras once again assembled the team of Terence Fisher as director and Jimmy Sangster as writer. Sangster based his script not so much on 1932's The Mummy, but rather on its sequels, The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Tomb, and The Mummy's Ghost. One of Universal's stipulations for the film was that Hammer once again needed to put Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in the lead roles, this time of the mummy hunter John Banning and the 4,000-year-old disgraced high priest turned walking mummy, Kharis. Cushing, riding high from his excellent portrayal of Sherlock Holmes in Hammer's The Hound of the Baskervilles, imbues Banning with a lot of youthful energy, despite the character limping around on a bum leg for the entire picture, while Lee makes for a deeply menacing monster that has an emotional arc expressed without a tongue. That said, Lee's performance as Kharis prior to mummification is pretty wooden, taking away from what is otherwise his second best Hammer villain behind Dracula. Meanwhile, the female lead, Isabel/Princess Ananka, is played by Shakespeare veteran Yvonne Furneaux, notable for her roles in great Italian films like Antonioni's La Amici and Fellini's La Dolce Vita. The antagonist of the film, Mehmet Bey, is played by Cypriot character actor George Pastel, who would go on to be a regular at Hammer and would appear in various spy films like From Russia with Love and Vendetta for the Saint. Other notable actors include Felix Aylmer as John's father, Stephen Banning, Raymond Huntley as the ever-skeptical Joseph Wimple, and Hammer mainstay Michael Ripper as the poor, drunken poacher.
I've seen the light tonight that mortal eye shouldn't look at.
Oh, you've been round to Molly Grady's again.
Filming on The Mummy began in late February of 1959 at Bray Studios, with 2 weeks of additional footage for the swamp scenes shot at Shepperton Studios. In order to save on both time and money, as had become standard for Hammer, a lot of sets were recycled from earlier productions, including Yesterday's Enemy and The Man Who Could Cheat Death. Though the historical accuracy of the film is questionable, to say the least, for example, Karnak is a place, not a god, they did try to lend some authenticity to the many ancient Egyptian props, including the box containing the Scroll of Life, which was a replica of a cartouche box found in King Tutankhamun's tomb. One of the most spectacular stage accessories, the glass fiber sarcophagus, was so good that, to this day, it can be found at the Perth Museum and Art Gallery. Christopher Lee suffered multiple minor injuries during principal photography. He banged up his knees and lower legs in the swamp due to unseen pipes and fittings getting in his way. He suffered burns from squibs. He threw his back out carrying Yvonne Furneaux, and in perhaps his biggest injury, he dislocated his shoulder when he crashed through this door, which had been mistakenly bolted right before the stunt. Another incidental injury occurred during the funeral procession scene. The actor wearing the Anubis mask was hired after the mask was created, and due to his enormous size, the mask was so tight and rigid that it drew blood. Peter Cushing, after seeing the poster artwork, suggested the idea of Kharis being impaled, and he managed to squeeze in another scene of his character leaping over furniture. And speaking of squeezing, this is the third of 3 Hammer movies I've covered where Christopher Lee's character strangles Peter Cushing's to the brink of death. Though this film is relatively light on the gore compared to other Hammer horror films, a couple of shots were trimmed at the behest of the British censors. The scene where Kharis has his tongue cut out was reportedly more graphic, and there was more to his death by shotgun in the final moments of the film. I should also note that director Terence Fisher took great umbrage at Hammer's growing reputation for blood and guts, insisting that he was very careful to imply more than show anything too grisly. Something that is certainly true for all 3 of the Hammer films I've covered this month. Hammer's The Mummy released on September 25, 1959, and went wide that October, smashing records for Universal International and Rank Film distributors. Though British critics were a little more generous this time around, American critics complained about the film's pace and structure. Still, on the whole, it did relatively well, critically speaking, for a Hammer film. Of course, the real prize was the box office, where the studio once again did incredibly good business. I'm unable to track down exact figures, but according to multiple sources, it may have broken records, but it still didn't quite reach the totals of Dracula. Nevertheless, it would inspire its own sequels, none of which featured Lee or Cushing, and it kept The Mummy alive as a horror property to be revived again and again over subsequent decades to varying degrees of success. Given my stated bias that The Mummy is my least favorite of the Universal classic monsters, it would be tempting to knock this adaptation for its flaws. I tend to agree with some of its early critics that the pace is a bit wonky, especially given how long and uneventful the overly narrated flashback scenes are. But nevertheless, I really like Hammer's version. In fact, I think it's better than any of the Mummy movies Universal put out in the 30s and 40s, and it's definitely better than the Tom Cruise movie from a few years ago. Though it of course is nowhere near as fun as the Brendan Fraser version, which I'd have to say is my favorite. Hammer was fully in its stride by this point, and The Mummy demonstrates many of the studio's biggest strengths, not the least of which are the duos of Fisher and Sangster or Cushing and Lee. The colorful set design and clever cinematography are on full display, and work especially well when showing ancient Egypt, doing a better job with a far smaller budget than 20th Century Fox would do a few years later with the infamous financial flop that is Cleopatra. I also like that The Mummy tackles some very tricky subject matter in an unblinking manner, including the treatment of mental health at the turn of the last century. The scenes involving the Banning father at the nursing home for the quote-unquote mentally disordered are surprisingly nuanced and well done, even though from a plot standpoint they only serve to introduce the hero to the fanciful idea of a living mummy out for revenge. But my single favorite scene comes much later, when John Banning goes to confront the Maleficent Bey. Sangster's dialogue here is incredible, filled with characters lying, double meanings, self-righteous innuendo, and a topic that comes dangerously close to being poignant. This is where the movie tackles the ethics of British imperialism. And no, before you write that comment, I'm not saying that because I'm some kind of academically brainwashed woke progressive liberal. I mean, really.
You pry and meddle with unclean hands and eyes. Profanity, blasphemy, religious desecration, all these you are guilty of.
The movie offers a nuanced take that stops short of coming to any concrete conclusions, leaving the characters in a murky state of moral uncertainty, where the dividing line between hero and villain gets just blurred enough to put audiences on edge. So yeah, I love this movie, and I do wish that Hammer had devoted as much time to its sequels as it did to those of Dracula and The Curse of Frankenstein. However, that doesn't stop 1959's The Mummy, standing alone, from being a true horror classic. And that's all for tonight, my dear mortals. Which version of The Mummy is your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hammer those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll finally hack the planet, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not desecrating an ancient burial site.
Well, I don't like the look of him.
Who?
The cove we're doing the carting for. He's a foreigner.
Well, he can't help that, poor chap.